What are you going to put as your hot take?
As my fifth hot take, and I'm gonna title this also "Hot Takes from the Sauna" because I was doing cardio in sauna before this, and I was coming up with my hot takes, and then also there was someone else in the sauna that started talking to me halfway through, so I
Uh-oh.
started hot taking on him.
Oh,
Like
good.
I was just like, he asked me like, "Oh, how long do you stay in the sauna for?" And I was like, 20, 30 minutes. And he's like, "This is my job. This is why I go in the sauna. I won't bore you with the details, but I just sort of like used that conversation to come up with the remainder of my hot takes.
Yeah,
So,
why don't you start from the top, man?
all right, I'm writing down right now number five, which we just came up with in our little like preamble breakfast talk here.
Okay.
So
If we
maybe
have some leftovers, we can drag it off into next week as well.
so let's just start backwards. This way I don't even have to write it down and we can just continue our conversation that we were having.
Okay.
My fifth hot take is that personal training can be highly ineffective without a person doing some training on their own. So I think it's really important that a person who's working with a personal trainer also do some training independent of the personal trainer or working out independent of the personal trainer. Because I think just generally play and exploration and just some time to be sort of introspective, sense things in your body, make decisions is a really important and sort of underappreciated thing in training. And just having trained people, some clients for a decade plus in person, you realize like, oh, they don't know how to make sometimes adjustments on the machine, or they don't know how much weight they use, or they don't know if something's bugging them, what to do about it. And there's different personality types that want to learn more about that, and other ones that just want to show up and be given in order, kind of just show up and receive training. But I don't think there's anything that you can derive a tremendous benefit from that's just going to be given to you in life, that's like a little bit more esoteric. But in
Mhm.
general, like if you're going to get something, it's usually going to be through the process of you experiencing it, you doing it yourself. So I think whether it be a teacher, from an education standpoint, because this conversation for us started with going to courses and the sort of uh, ratio of like how much time you're spending going to courses and learning from gurus versus how much time you're spending on your own studying and sort of testing your mettle. And then we moved on to this idea of personal training, where I just brought up, man, I think like people would get even more out of personal training, or certainly go a lot further in their ability to execute good training if they did some amount on their own, because there's just so much to be had in the little nuances of, if I put pressure through my hand in this way, or if I change the direction I'm moving just a tiny bit, it can really relieve anything from just like orthopedic issues to changes in the like inertial effects of what you're doing. And that might also influence you orthopedically, or that might influence, even what tissues are being trained, or to what degree you're able to fatigue those tissues. And it's the little nuanced thing that we can't really measure in science, like because it's so small and it's different at every moment in time between every person, but it's the ability to make decisions for yourself based on what you're feeling. Essentially, we're talking about intuition, and
Mhm.
intuition only comes from hours and hours of practice and repetition on your own. So I just think to some degree that's one thing that's often missing from personal training.
Yeah, and I think that that is, although that is a hot take, I feel like when people hear that, I would find it difficult to imagine someone would be able to disagree with at least the concept of it. Of course, there are clients who, as you mentioned, are just very much like they just want to detach from thinking, and they're not really interested in that kind of a thing. But I totally agree. And I like the example that you were giving prior to the call. Can you kind of just briefly mention the thing about posing and just like a coach's eye and specifically the intricacies of like, you know, learning about posing in your experience on your own versus with the coach and like the pros and cons of either one of those things?
Yeah, so it's also after now many seasons of having different coaches, different posing coaches. So there is some degree of like, you have these initial mentors, and eventually the idea should be that you learn something from these mentors, i.e., like the basic principles,
Yeah.
and then you go home on your own and you apply those basic principles at first, sort of like within the box that they've given you. So you're thinking the way that they think through the lens that they're looking through, and you try to make the improvements, very specific to what they're telling you to do. You're basically just following orders. But I've certainly, and this is a good example for me because posing is something that I'm just not particularly interested in. I like the process of bodybuilding altogether, but the competitions, the posing, the trunks, the shaving, the tanning,
Yeah.
so, we're talking about much like for a general population person coming in to work out, like posing is the reason I hire a posing coach and not a, personal trainer is because I'm very passionate and interested in the training piece. But the posing piece at first, I just hired, I mean, the first person I hired was, relatively inexpensive, but they would see me every day. So I just wanted accountability. Like I knew I would do it, but I knew I would do it in a more focused way if I had
Mhm.
to be accountable to. And over time, I got more specific about what I was looking for in a coach, and I saw them less and less frequently. So over time, the frequency in which I saw a coach and sort of the level of coach that I had went up and up. And now I feel like I'm at the point where I can bring things to that posing coach and say, hey, I'm trying this on my own. Like, what do you think? How does it look? And then other times where now I might do something on my own that they had suggested even against or didn't like, and you know I like it better, or other people that are judges or experts, in the sport like it as well. So then you can kind of branch off and have your own unique thoughts. It's certainly not a starting place, but I think that is a good progression of learning. And again, it's an area where I think I'm much more similar to the average person coming in to work with a personal trainer because it wasn't just a subject of interest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And my experience of learning the last however long has been pretty similar to that trajectory where at first it's all just kind of memorization, regurgitation, creating of a baseline. It's kind of like where someone like, you don't have any sort of map of the sort of territory and someone hands you a map and they kind of like fill different things out for you. So then you start to get an understanding of like, oh, the grocery store is over here and the pharmacy is over here. And like, someone can kind of tell you those things at first, but eventually, maybe you can sort of start to erase things, rewrite your own map. If you ever want to get to that point as you continue to kind of troubleshoot. I've personally found that like the thing that's been most helpful for me, and let's say in the last year in terms of learning, has not necessarily been like, of course, it's very helpful to see a study that I've never seen before, or learn about, for example, last week I spent like 2 hours one day just focused on like the knee joint and knee kinematics and knee kinetics. And so I learned some stuff about the patella that I didn't know about. That stuff is interesting, but the most helpful thing has not been that. It has more so been like the classic, you sit down with a blank sheet of paper sort of a thing. And just create a map that's, maybe like you're trying to answer a question and you just ask like, hey, what do I, think about this? And that's definitely, I feel like, how people arrive at like nutritional practices that work for them as well as training practices. So we're off to a hot start. Would you like me to go next, or do you want to go sort of like, you want to go one and one, or you want to go one person's through?
Um, I would say you go next, And I think in general, it'd be better to sort of go one on one because people might get exhausted listening to me for a while.
Okay.
But the next series of hot takes, I think, kind of go together for me. It's sort of like one begets the next one. So,
Okay, so I will go and then you can integrate the next two together.
sure.
That works? Okay. I was wondering why he was smirking at me. Um, okay, so as you might expect, my hot takes are mostly like mechanics related. And the conversation around, well, I'll just start with the simple sort of hot take, which is that I think that the distinction between compound and isolation exercises is kind of a useless distinction. And that in a certain, if you wanted to make that more esoteric, like if I were making a YouTube title for that, my YouTube title would be like, compound exercises don't exist or something like that. And so you and I have talked about this like before, at least it was a long time ago on the podcast, like maybe like the first 5 or 10. I think it was with Hector, where we were talking about like compound versus isolation for chest stuff. And I just feel like when people think about compound and isolation exercises, they don't think about any of the objective qualities of what creates a compound thing and what creates an isolation thing. Instead, what happens is they conjure up an image in their head of like not really anything specific about any motion or anything useful to understand about emotion, but more so like this idea of, compound is like this really this sort of like shotgun approach. And the shotgun approach is great because you do all these things simultaneously. And that is like what most people need. Most people need the shotgun approach. I'm speaking as if I'm someone else. And, they say about the isolation stuff, they say, well, the isolation stuff, it's really just for like bodybuilders, or that's really just if you want to like really grow this specific body part. But all of that sort of just is in my estimation like not only is it I think a waste of time to think about those things that way, it's just it oftentimes ends up making people conclude things that are either totally illogical, such as just an obvious one being like compounds are best and isolations are a waste. That's like the most extreme version of it. But you still kind of will hear people saying like high level pros talking about how we do the compounds first and we do the isolations later because the compounds like require more energy. So there are a lot of like particularities that I could dig into. I just want to give one example to sort of demonstrate this concept of like compound being an isolation thing and isolations being a compound thing. So first of all, when you hear isolation prompts you to believe that like this is like a very focal thing. And in terms of outcome, like it definitely can be. But I think what that leads people to do in isolation exercises is it leads people to not consider anything else in that particular motion other than the thing that they're working. And most of the time, and I'm interested to see if you agree with this, I feel like what you need to focus on most in a quote isolation exercise is actually everything other than the specific muscle that you're training, right? It's like, am I basically putting myself in a position to where I really don't even have to think about much other than just doing the curl or the raise or the extension? And so in a weird sense, you have to think sort of in compound terms when you're doing isolation things. And weirdly enough, any exercise which is compound, like truly compound, meaning like, and when I say truly compound, I mean like you choose an exercise which is substantially stimulating more than a single muscle group. So like a barbell bench press falls under that category because of the constraints of the bench press. A barbell squat falls under that category. A hack squat falls under that category. Leg press, right? So obviously you can go to certain extremes, but ultimately like you're working within the bounds of something that's inherently um, compound. But where I think the issue starts with the whole compound category is specifically in relation to seeing multiple joints move and assuming that the stimulus is compound. So, for example, you could do two different presses, one of which is a barbell press, another of which is a dumbbell press, and the dumbbell press in effect is like a fairly isolated thing. right? Or a better example would be a cable converging press, right? A cable converging press to many people's naked eye looks exactly like a barbell bench press, but just with a cable. But because of how distinct the objective features of those exercises are, in effect, the thing that looks compound in the cable chest press is actually very isolated in its effect. And the thing that looks like a cable press, with a barbell is much more sort of widely distributed. Um, so the terms, just to sort of summarize, like compound and isolation, I think are kind of useless in the sense that they don't really help, in my estimation, to a lot of times guide decision making because they sort of force people to imagine very like low resolution pictures of these things. And so oftentimes the conversation I find stops there and it doesn't go any further, even to the level of like talking about direction of resistance or how a barbell is different than dumbbells or how dumbbells are different from cables. And I think that is where the value is. I don't think that the value is in really either one of those terms, at least at face value, and at least the way that most people are talking about those things. So,
Yeah, I agree with what you were saying in terms of in a quote unquote isolation exercise, what's not moving being more of the focal point than what is moving in terms of joints.
yeah.
I almost picture, just like analogies off the cuff as they often do here, but I'm like picturing a swing set wherein like you
Mhm.
have this really stable base that allows this expression of movement through the swing. And, it's almost like when I'm training to failure, like the moving joint is essentially the swing. And, you get a little bit of, you get a shove or you get a little bit of leg swing going. And that swing is just swinging on this stable base, right? If the base were to change, like for example, the metal that's supporting you above or on the sides, if that were to collapse or become loose or flimsy, it would influence the ability of that swing to move through space. So that has to stay stable. That constraint has to be there. But then eventually the swing just loses, it loses height. The amount of distance it's traveling becomes less and less. And you could look at that, through sort of like a velocity component or a distance component, much like we would um, observing an exercise where someone's training to failure, and maybe we see they slow down as they're approaching failure, or maybe we see that the range of motion gets shorter, and maybe they're just kind of doing length and partial. So I'm just picturing this swing that is just moving less and less, and eventually you just settle down. And that's kind of what the moving joint is to me, on an isolation exercise.
Mm.
That is the foundation that has to be set, and that just allows uh, the swing to express movement. And then the
Mhm.
movement just kind of happens, and eventually it stops, and then I'm done. That's kind of like the picture that I'm making up, but that's sort of how it feels, when I'm doing an isolation exercise.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Never thought of that before. Yeah, I kind of also feel like the same, you could definitely apply the same concept to a quote compound type of motion in that focusing on what is not moving is often more important than what is moving, just because what is moving is so obvious and it's like, move your arm here. It's not that difficult. I do think the failure point in terms of technique is mostly things that should be not moving are moving,
Mhm.
rather than I'm not moving my arm in this particular correct direction or something like that. Um, so yeah, so in summary, I will still continue to use those words, but only because I'm in somewhat of a trap with people using those words and needing to use them. And also because although I am criticizing the terms, I do not have a better alternative, because to make a better alternative would be to simplify an exercise down to a single generalized description, which I don't think is ever helpful outside of just communication. So, for example, I can say squat, but like the outcome of squat could be 10 different things if you have 10 different people, in front of you with their squatting with their body weight, for example. So much like names of exercises can be problematic in terms of saying anything about them, I find that those terms are also problematic. Um, okay, so let's hear your next 1/2. We'll call it 1.5 hot takes that are allegedly integrated.
I also actually, ironically, I think it integrates pretty well into what I think could be like a counter argument to the concept of like using compound and isolation as terms, which is just simply the reality in practice is so often, we have to meet people where they're at. And if there are already terms that people can identify with, so
Yeah.
there's, sort of a general picture in people's mind, like you mentioned a bunch of exercises where if you just, if I went back to the gym I was at a minute ago and I just pulled a bunch of, like 18-year-old kids working out there, uh,
Hmm.
tell me some compound, tell me some isolation exercises. I think we'd find on average that the compound exercises, are going to, on a one-for-one basis, are going to be more time efficient in terms of training more, total muscles through like a concentric in a concentric and eccentric fashion. So, not in the sense of like, oh, how many different muscles are being worked to some degree, but maybe better put like how many muscles are getting a stimulus, like a significant stimulus for muscle growth. If
Yeah.
we're not arranging things any differently, if we're not changing, the way that we superset things or the way that we change rest intervals, all of which in practice, can make some of these concepts less relevant. If we just say, all right, we're doing isolation exercises, but maybe also it's less like systemically fatiguing in some way, shape, or form. Therefore, we rest less in between sets and we can also superset things. If you have a lot of background knowledge, it's easy to configure a training session where those concepts are essentially irrelevant.
Right.
But when the only context you have is that you know more or less what people mean when they say compound and isolation, and you have a certain amount of time to train, the fastest way to express a time efficient training manner to someone might be just, do a few compound exercises,
Mhm.
rather than if their only other choice was do a few isolation exercises, you would probably get more bang for your buck from a hypertrophy standpoint. I'll let you touch on that topic, but the first hot take that I had, was just simply that time is our universal limiter, and there's really two things that we need to start with: is just time and fatigue. Those are the two things that I think everyone really is always managing, but not so much conscious of. And if we
Mhm.
come back to those two fundamental concepts, I think we can really um, more precisely align our goals with our behaviors when we're just managing those two. So it just starts with time is important. And a lot of people have a set amount of time that they're willing to put towards something, either consciously or unconsciously. They're doing this. They're falling into the same patterns. And if something were a more time efficient strategy, um, that is likely the better option for most people. And we're working within the constraints of what they're actually going to do and their current level of knowledge. So there's probably a lot of times in practice where like doing the compounds over the isolations, might be the best choice for someone in that situation.
Yeah. So yeah, totally fair point. I think what I would say in response to that particular line of thinking is just that in a lot of instances, I think that the threshold stimulus for, we'll say, secondary, tertiary muscle groups in a compound exercise may not necessarily be enough for a given individual based on the way they do it, their anatomy, the interaction between the way that they have it set up and their bones and their tissue structures, and whatnot. It may just be like, just to put it into really concrete terms, like someone can do a bench press, and just because of their anatomy and how they've been told to bench press, maybe it's like on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like an 8 for pecs, a or let's say like it's a 6 for pecs, it's a 9 for front delts, and then it's like a 2 for triceps. Just theoretically, that could be possible. The inverse of that could also be possible. So, there's one side of it, which is like there may be a certain threshold stimulus that someone who is a beginner may meet initially, but who, if they sort of continue to do that, maybe it sort of falls below threshold. And then the other instance is just like if someone doesn't really have a great understanding of what they're doing, it could be the case that something like a bench press could sort of be, we'll say stimulating a muscle such that maybe maybe it gets sore, maybe there's a pump in the muscle, maybe they see progress on the motion, and yet still for some reason there's just something about the way that it is set up or executed that makes it such that even the muscle groups that are being trained more than others in that motion are being, we'll say, less specifically targeted than if they were to do, even just half the amount of volume in like an isolation based setting. So a good example of that might be like if you look at, and I know this is very specific examples, but if you look at like most powerlifters um, will develop like humongous front delts and triceps, and a lot of them surprisingly have like very like small chests. And so there's kind of something weird going on there, which is like, well, on one hand, it's like the bench press is clearly advertised as a pec exercise, but in the context of powerlifting, like the way they set it up, the way that the total volumes that they use are a lot of times at least as high as like the average bodybuilding amount of volume, just specific to bench press, not necessarily the other motions. Um, and yet for whatever reason, like a lot of people seem not to develop like super, super good or super big pecs relative to other groups. So that is kind of just what I would present as the other side of it, is like the way that my problem is more with the way that it is advertised as like if you do a bench press equals chest and triceps and plenty of both. But I think in some instances, just to summarize, the stimulus based on the way it's set up could fall below that threshold, or just for whatever reason, even if it does meet some sort of threshold, maybe it's orthopedically unsustainable in some way, as compound exercises tend to have a greater propensity to be, I think, relative to isolation exercises. And yeah, the amount of time, although each individual set or total volume of that exercise may take less total time, you may not need to volume equate. So, 5 sets of bench may equal 1 or 2 sets of pec flies, just as a, silly sort of concrete example of that. So that's kind of everything else that I would say. But I still think that all of your counter arguments hold true in some instances as well.
So getting back to that first hot take of the most the most universal constraint that we all have is time. And then within that, in terms of managing time, we are also biological organisms that need to manage fatigue. I think those are the sort of fundamental two principles that we're working with. And I think a lot of people underestimate how much time they're actually willing to put into something and overestimate the amount of fatigue that they're incurring from it. So the reality that I observe is most people are in a cycle of putting a fixed amount of time towards a goal without really knowing it. Like they've fallen into just a pattern, a groove that most of it they didn't do consciously. They didn't set out to be exactly where they are. Life circumstances, genetics, um, environment have sort of brought them to a place many people don't even know exactly how they got there per se, but now they've built this environment around them that has very much fixed them habitually. So they put a certain amount of time towards training, and they, much like with people who are in personal training, much like with clients who are personal training, most of them over time are pretty weight stable. Like they have times where they go up and they go down. But if you just, if you're at a personal training gym for a decade or so and you just observe most trainers and most clients, they're pretty much weight stable across time, which actually is not too bad because the rest of the population is gaining
Yeah.
30% a year. So not bad. Um, but in order to sort of move from that well, from this just like sort of increasingly deep crease that they've behaviorally sort of found themselves in, it takes a significant amount of effort to change directions. So in the weight instance, for example, to really be hypercaloric for a significant amount of time and then to maintain somewhere near that calories to keep your body weight elevated above the sort of homeostatic baseline that you've either set through like behaviors as a teenager or young adult, where you first started lifting, you were going through puberty, you're hyper interested in it, that kind of thing. And then you gained your first, 20 pounds or so. And then you hit this point where it just got more difficult. And
Hmm.
now you're just kind of hanging out in this spot where like you try a little bit harder sometimes, you try a little bit less hard some other times, you go on vacation here and there, you eat more, you eat less, but you just kind of settle into this groove, into this well over time. And I think fundamentally, to shift out of that groove, you have to specifically partition your time. That's the number one thing that you have to spend. And how you arrange your day and how you arrange your life is all about where you partition time and energy. And like I said, energy also, results in fatigue. Because even if we were a mechanical system, like there would still be some fatigue built into that as well.
Hmm.
So when we pick a goal, and as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, it often comes back to like who are we talking about and what is their goal. And so often the questions I get are not the right questions because the person hasn't identified yet what their goal is, where they're trying to go, either on a grand scale or more on an acute scale of what they're trying to accomplish in a given period of time. But I think we like when I sit down with people for consultations, there's always a calendar in front of us. We say, okay, the vacations are here, like this is the general direction. Even if we don't set a specific written goal, there's still a general ethos of where we're trying to go. Like I had a brand new person yesterday, and one of the last things he asked me was just like, okay, well, what specific goals are we going to set, for this mesocycle? It's like, well, I have no idea how you're going to respond. I don't know, on X amount of sets, X amount of calories, X amount of milligrams or whatever, what your body's going to give us. So we can't have necessarily like an exact written roadmap. Whereas when I look, when I set my own goals at this point, I can look back on years of data and experience and have some realistic expectations about the direction I want to move in. But overall, it just starts with a certain ethos of just like, this is sort of where I see things, like almost written and not so much written, but more in like a vision, more in an internal sense of this is the direction you want to go. And then from there, you break out the paper and you say, okay, this is how much time I'm putting towards these things. And if you choose to work, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, in either a job where you're passionate about something else, like you, for example, you've chosen to be an educator, you put a certain amount of time towards that during the day, or other people who are personal trainers, they put a certain amount of time. But, within the first couple of weeks that you and I met, and I had a sense of, I think, the type of person you were and the potential you had, my advice to you was spend the least amount of time training people right now. Like just, don't focus on trying to build a big roster of clients because you're going to sort of pigeonhole yourself into that. Focus on educating yourself, investing in yourself, and then you'll always have an endless stream of clients because you'll have value. But if
Mhm,
you just focus, in the business, you get stuck.
mhm.
So I know this has kind of gone like right field as I often do, but I think the biggest picture concept that I'm just going to work the rest of the hot takes off of is you have to be specific about how you spend your time. And even with that, like for example, in contest prep, the time that I spend on training isn't different. Um, and the time I spend eating isn't different. I spend a little bit more time. I spend time every day posing pre-contest, whereas I just do that once a week now. But we're talking about a 20-minute difference per day. The major difference really is in the fatigue generated during contest prep. And because of that, the fatigue from dieting, just overall like being in an energy deficit for a long time, being hyper lean, um, that doesn't necessarily change the time component, but it changes how much energy you can put towards things. So when you're mapping, out of schedule, when you're mapping out a direction goal, you also have to account for the fatigue aspect, which is, um, like I mentioned before, both this concept of time and fatigue. I'm going to come back to, in some other hot takes, but I feel like I don't even need to segue this now into the next one. I feel like we can, discuss this a little bit more if you want, and then I'll just let you tackle your next take.
Well, no, that's really great, and I really did appreciate hearing that from you because, and I still remember like the exactly where we were, what I asked, what you said, by the front desk. Uh, my parents' dog is gonna bark at the squirrel probably. Um, but yeah, that really stuck with me, and that was like hugely influential. Um, and I just felt like, because at the time you were exactly right, where I had this temptation to just take on more and more and more and more. And the only reason that I was able to allocate any time to education was because I consciously decided to forego the short-term financial gain, and in-person experience for that. And that just obviously I've ended up kind of exactly, at least in retrospect, where I would have wanted to, which I feel really lucky to say, as I mentioned to you.
Well,
Um,
just to interrupt for a second, like
yeah,
if you have taken no clients, like obviously you were training people before that to some degree, maybe more athletes than Gen Pop.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you take no people, then you don't get a lot of like in the trenches experience. But if you have 3 clients a day versus 10 clients a day, this concept that you love to make fun of me now for using the word asymptote, but like it reaches diminishing returns, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
learn much more having 10 clients. Like there's this, once you've trained, 1,000 hours of general population, like you kind of get the gist. So there's not that much more that you learn from that process. And maybe there's a percentage here and, a tiny point there. But if you decided like, all right, I kind of want, the Pareto principle out of this, like I want to get the 80/20, it doesn't take a ton of investment to get that. It's like if you want to have good teeth, like just 2-minute timer on your toothbrush and like see your dentist a couple times a year. Like it's not
Hmm.
like a super high investment. If you do none of it, it's, pretty high risk, but the investment to get to, pretty good is not super high. So you could put in like a few clients a day. And in my case, like that's what I still do, on average, like, 2, 3 clients a day. And the rest of the days, bodybuilding, education, that sort of stuff.
Hmm. Yeah. And I only had, in my long-winded career, um, I only had a couple of days where it was like 10, 12 sessions. And that just also wouldn't have been sustainable for me either. Maybe even like any more than like five was just like it was just too much for me. Say whatever you want about me to the listener, make your
I
value
mean,
judgment, but
time is still a big concept here, right? Because time's still part of the arbiter of adaptation, right? It's like
right.
it's like tripling your training volume, from one week to the next. So I
Yeah.
think, in reality, people who go from, a few clients a day to five clients to 10, and then they do, you know, eight clients a day or whatever for years on end, like anything else, I think you adapt to it. So it's not the same as like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
going in and doing a 50 set leg session. Uh,
Yeah.
but at the same time, like if you're present and reflective on it, you may realize like I don't feel like I'm deriving a lot out of this for the level
Mhm.
at least that I experience acutely.
Yeah, and I am someone just to preface this who greatly appreciates training people, helping people. In essence, I still feel like I kind of end up doing like informal sessions every week, of some kind, just like helping people around the gym, which I do love. Um, but sometimes like in internet arguments, which I now no longer participate in, like I can officially say, at least publicly, I just have made a rule. I'm not commenting on people publicly. I'm not engaging with that stuff. But the way that people often, specifically trainers, will try to take shots at me is they will talk about how I don't have a consistent roster now, which is true. And in in my estimation, what I have found and what I sort of did find with personal training is there are many things that are very interesting about personal training, but like the mechanics side of personal training, especially once you've worked with someone for like a couple weeks, is like should be very simple. And if it's really not simple, then like I think something's going wrong. Like something needs to
Yeah, like
change.
you get some people that are like banged up, maybe coming to you, maybe that's how they found you. And
Yeah.
if like, they're still getting banged up a year later, like what are you doing? So
Yeah.
you just end up with a bunch of people that feel great, enjoy their training, and it just becomes a social experience, which is
Yeah.
actually kind of great, if you're trying to be a professional bodybuilder to just show up and like hang out with cool people for a couple hours a day. Like I do
Yeah.
think there's a lot of benefit in that. But I don't think maybe and if you have the right clients too, you can benefit in terms of like learning things outside of the gym. It's like the only place I get my news. It's the only place I learn about anything besides, lifting heavy things and how to eat to support that. But from to sort of piggyback off what you said, I've been doing this for 15 years or so in some capacity, whether it was with athletes or with Gen Pop now. Um, and I don't feel like I'm gaining much like on a day-to-day basis as far as like learning to be better at my craft by doing it with the same people. Like if
Yeah.
you're a physical therapist and you have new clients, every week, I think it's a little bit different than the personal trainer who's seeing someone they've been seeing for 10 years. Like that person should be able to do it on their own. If
Hmm.
they can't, like it's a really big disservice. They might choose to come to you because they like you as a person, but if they can't work out on their own after a year or so, you're really doing them a disservice. And I see that in my consultations where that actually is the goal. Where
Hmm.
in the beginning, I don't tell them specifically you need to see me this often. I just say in the beginning, like we're gonna need to meet a little bit more frequently because there's gonna be a lot of things to a lot of stones to turn over, and maybe I see them every week or 2 weeks or whatever. But then like a year later, they're only coming, every 6 or 8 weeks, maybe like between training blocks in the middle of a training block. And they a lot of times kind of can predict where I'm going to go with things. And I think that's a good thing. And that's their like explicit goal is to come in and learn and be able to do it on their own. Whereas
Hmm.
with personal training, it's not that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And to circle back just to the time constraint conversation and to kind of weave our takes together here. The inspiration for this podcast topic, like the hot takes topic to begin with, was me encountering because as you know, I went to this gym that I don't normally go to this week, and I was overhearing one of the trainers talking very loudly to their clients. And the client was, a woman probably in her mid 30s, if I had to guess, looked like she was maybe a mom, um, uh, per my non-professional appraisal. And she was probably 5 feet away from a cable stack. And the trainer, who was also a woman, had her holding the cable with one arm in front of her, and she was again about 5 feet away. So the load is basically, horizontal. If she's standing up, it's basically horizontal relative to her torso, maybe slightly downward. So it's not doing anything but like just pulling her body forward. And she had this woman doing single leg RDLs with the cable that was pulling basically horizontal to her torso. And she was, of course, as anyone might expect, even anyone who has never been a trainer, that's a challenging thing to do, even for someone who's trained. It's like the balancing component of that is the biggest challenge. And so I overheard the client start the conversation, and she said, "Man, this is like really hard. Like this is great." As if it, which is understandable, I guess, from her perspective. And the trainer responded and said, "Yeah, why would we ever do anything like isolated when we can just do everything at the same time?"
Yeah, or nothing.
And- right, or nothing. Right. Of course, that was my first thought, but it did sort of integrate those two takes, right? Because the essence of what she's saying is related to time, right? But uh, what she's saying specifically is completely backwards insofar as, or at least insofar as like the effectiveness is concerned. But what she's pointing to is also this distinction between like compound versus isolation. Like we can just do this single leg RDL thing, which in essence is really neither compound nor isolation based on, what the outcome would be. I don't know if you could really call it an exercise. It was more like some kind of fun activity that one could do, after waking up or something to, loosen up or something. But
It still
we're,
comes back to the goal, right? It's like, the time and the fatigue are under this umbrella of um under the umbrella of goal. It's just like you've decided that you want to go in a particular direction. You're going to go with the premise that you have some degree of free will. And if you want to get to X point, you have to decide how you want to partition your time and energy towards it. So if we
Mhm.
start off with the goal of like, oh, it's, I want to hypertrophy my hamstrings, you know, then we could look at that exercise and be like, well, what, if progressive overload is, a basic tenet of adaptation and, muscle growth, like, well, let's just try adding, a quarter pound, to that cable stack every week. Let me know how that ends up like
Yeah,
in
yeah.
in a few weeks, right? Because it's just like at some point you're just going to get pulled forward. So maybe if the explicit goal was like, I just want her to learn how to do this because she has back pain when she bends over to pick up her dog's toys. But when she does kind of like a single leg RDL motion, that allows her to be pain free and pick up her dog's toys. So like, and she is learning it better when I give her something that pulls her forward and it helps her teach her to hit backwards. But as like a method of progressive overload, over time, it's just like, maybe not the best tool for the job.
Yeah, yeah. I find that once you get to the point where you have to state the goal as the activity in some like hyper specific context, it's like we should probably draw a line like 10 steps before that, like why am I doing this single leg Bosu ball chaos bar back squat? Because I would like to really get good at, single leg Bosu ball cable chaos bar back squat, right? Um,
And
so yeah, I agree. I agree, and I see the point is taken.
I think I could segue this into another hot take,
Okay.
kind of lateral, but um, still still is consistent with this concept of like identifying the goal. And straight out of the sauna, guy sitting next to me, he's like, well, he notices that like everyone else is leaving, and it's just like been the two of us in here for a while. People are just like coming and going, and he looks like
Classic.
he's in pretty good, pretty good shape overall. And he's just like, hey, bro, how long do you usually spend in the sauna? And the most common question I get in regards, one of the most, like, definitely top three that I get from a layperson in regards to bodybuilding is how many hours a week do you spend in the gym?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're using this initial premise, which I just stated that like time is an incredibly important concept when you know when trying to set a path towards a goal. But that's just the starting place. So it shows like, okay, they have this, seemingly dumb question to us, but conceptually, like you would think, or intuitively, you would think that's actually a pretty good question. So I understand where they're coming from.
Mhm.
They think I just spend more time lifting, but there's all these other factors underneath, like how much, absolute load am I using? Like how much more am I able to get out of a particular set? Like what what other limitations might a really big strong person have that doesn't allow them to just linearly train more hours, and what's the progression of like sets over a career. Like there's so many other little factors that branch off of time that person uh, is ignorant of when they ask the question. So to you and I, it sounds kind of stupid, like, oh, you just think that because I spend more time in the gym, that's why I'm more jacked than you. On average, that is probably always true. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like if you just pick the average Gen Pop person, personal training client out of the gym who usually asks me that type of question, um, they would never be wrong. So it's kind of like the compounded isolation thing. Like it's actually not an incorrect proxy for them, because I probably do actually lift weights, 3 times as many hours as they do.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking in my head, oh, that's a dumb question. There's so much more that goes into it that you're just totally unaware of. Um, but coming back, around to the sauna again, the guy's like, how many minutes do you, spend in here? And it's actually a very appropriate question for the sauna because the dose is fixed, right? Like the
Mhm.
intensity is fixed. So, the last woman who asked me that question about how many hours do you train, it's like she's training 20, 30 reps, short of failure easily on an exercise. So it's not so much that she needs to spend more time, it's more of the fatigue equation, is
Yeah.
that not getting a whole lot of adaptation because he's not driving a whole lot of fatigue. But in the case of the sauna, it's a fixed temperature. You're dealing with two different bodies. Like the guy talking to me, who's probably buck 50 or so, so I'm almost like twice his body weight. So when we began talking about the benefits of the sauna, I said, my heart rate gets up to what would be considered like a low intensity cardio kind of zone, maybe 120, 130, 140 if I'm in there for 30 minutes plus, it'll get up there in a 200-degree sauna. And he's like, you know what? Like my heart rate doesn't go up at all. In fact, like I think it goes down when I'm in the sauna. It doesn't go down, and he like checks his Apple Watch and he's like 100 and something. I'm like, I hope you're not 100 beats per minute.
Yeah.
Fast. And it's not like he had come in from a workout. He was just starting his session in there. Um, but my point was that uh, what my heart needs to do in 200 degrees is pretty different than what his does, but we're still dealing with a similar stressor that is this 200-degree heat. And he was explaining to me that he works outdoors. He does like a manual labor job, and with the recent heat wave, all of his like coworkers were complaining just like how difficult it was to work in the heat. But he's in the sauna for 20 minutes every day, and he said it's like a breeze. And I said, you know
Oh,
what?
cool.
That's to me a very good application of the sauna. Like it's very specific. You might see that in athletes who acclimatize, to different places that they're going to compete in, whether that be at altitude, heat, sun exposure, etc. Specificity is king, and for him, that actually like is a pretty reasonable thing to use it for.
Hmm.
So then we got to talking about, why else the sauna might be beneficial, and this is where my like general hot take comes in. One, just broadly, I don't think sauna and ice bath are quote unquote good recovery modalities. That's part of the hot take. But the
Hmm.
more broad hot take is I like to just step back even further so we can apply this to as many concepts as possible. I don't think you should use the terms fatigue and recovery in specific contexts without specific explanations. So, when I'm talking about a really general concept like setting a goal and then managing time and fatigue, uh, the understanding is that the umbrella of time and the umbrella of fatigue encompasses a lot of different things underneath it. So you have to realize that there's hundreds, thousands of other branches that fall underneath that, but these are big, big picture concepts that if you're not managing those, then you're missing some of the core concepts of why you're managing the things underneath it.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think when we're talking about a very specific modality for a very specific reason, and then you use a general concept like fatigue or recovery to explain its benefits, I don't think it's appropriate to do so without explaining what's recovering or what's being fatigued because it's way too general of a concept.
So I would assume then that you would take some kind of issue with someone saying, for example, that like they're going to take an active recovery day by going on a hike or something. Would you take issue with that? Because to me, based on that, it kind of feels like active and recovery are almost antithetical, right? It's like
I don't think
activity.
so at like a base level. I think a level of activity that is consistent with your normal behaviors
Yeah.
make so for example, like I walk on average 12 to 15,000 steps a day, depending on height.
Yeah.
If I go and walk 30,000 steps, that will not be recovery.
Yeah.
If I sit around all day and I get 1,000 steps, that might be appropriate for certain situations, but on average, that's probably not going to be ideal either. Much
Hmm.
like I can eat a very large meal before bed, and that doesn't seem to interrupt my sleep. And in fact, if I didn't eat before bed, it really does interrupt my sleep. Now, again, talking about, hold on, one second.
Okay,
Like
I'll
talking
just write
about,
it down.
a like 280, 300 pound person, a large meal for me is still, in context, it's still relative to my body weight. So if I'm eating, even right now where I'm trying to keep my weight on the lower side, my average meals are still like 12, 1,300 calories. So for me to eat a 1,200 calorie meal before bed is completely normal. And that's what my body is used to. Now, on Saturday nights, like when we go out for a big meal and it's kind of like a social experience, maybe there's some THC involved. I might, double, triple, quadruple those calories at times, right? And
Yeah.
that will interrupt my sleep, but it's relative to what you're used to. So um, there are certain things that are just kind of built in to our genes, our normal behavior, like what our ancestors would have done, like being out in nature, getting some activity, like being social. But if you think about it on the flip side, if you're someone who really doesn't like being out in nature, and the thought is being out in nature is good for recovery, but for whatever reason you're terrified of being outdoors or you just hate it, chances are that's not going to be recovery. So, another hot take might be like within this is recovery is what makes you feel recovered,
Hmm.
not what someone tells you recovers you. You know,
Hmm.
in general, you recover you. It happens from the inside. And there's some drugs that you might be able to use to recover certain systems at the cost of other systems, but you're going to pay for it somewhere. So you're
Hmm.
always paying with one hand, and receiving with the other. Because even if you're like, yeah, I just take growth hormone and insulin and testosterone, like it's not that you don't pay for that somewhere, but you're recovering in the systems that you want to recover while you're taxing other parts of your biology at the same time. So there's always some trade-off. And that's why I think you have to be hyper specific. Like, could a sauna and an ice bath be the right recovery tool under a certain situation? Sure. If you're, a 7 foot tall, 300-pound guy running up and down a basketball court and you need to do it again tomorrow, hopping in an ice bath will probably may in certain situations allow you to feel less sore and less beat up when you go to do it. But if you apply that same concept to, because what the guy in the sauna said to me is like, I think it makes me more recovered because I feel less sore, I think, when I do it. And I said, well, let's think of some other things that make you feel less sore in regards to resistance training. They include NSAIDs, antioxidants, ice baths, and all of these things have been shown to be negative for hypertrophy.
And
So,
and also training also makes you less sore usually.
yeah.
Like training more makes you less sore. Yeah.
So, I think but in another situation where maybe that was like the sauna was a tool that you're using, for example, to just build a little bit of background, like cardiometabolic health. And that is something long term that just could, like, for example, keep your blood pressure down. For a really large strength athlete, keeping their blood pressure down is going to keep them alive and keep them in the gym and keep them feeling good. And maybe, the consequences of that are longer training blocks and a longer career. Sure, you trade one thing for another thing, but don't think for a second that you ever get that for free. So, in
Mhm.
the context of time and fatigue, when it comes to contest prep for me, the sauna is not a good investment because I already have cardiovascular fitness in spades at that point. I already have a high degree of fatigue that I've accumulated through low body fat, high energy expenditure, low energy intake. So my margin for adding additional fatigue is low, and heat stress is absolutely going to be a form of fatigue. You're also going to need to, rehydrate and replenish electrolytes, and it's not going to be positive if you needed to, train anytime close to that session, but also just on the margins throughout the week. It might be something that makes you feel better when you come out of it, but that doesn't mean that it's going to cost your body anything to adapt to. Like,
Mhm.
if it's going to potentially drive some adaptation, which is why people would recommend the sauna in the first place, either just because it makes you feel really good when you get out, or because we're looking for some type of cardiovascular adaptation, or maybe um, sweating out potential things that are negative in our body, like heavy metals, that kind of stuff. Um, these are all long-term things that we get over time, but don't necessarily benefit us acutely. So you can decide to make that trade-off, but I think you should always recognize that there's a trade-off, and based on the time you have available and based on the fatigue cost of it, it might not be the appropriate trade-off for the situation you're in.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I'm glad you brought that up. And kind of what I'm hearing, and I think the great takeaway from that is like so much of that stuff just depends on where you currently are within the confines of the thing, you know? So a lot of people, for just one more example, they find like stretching very relaxing. But if you do like deep stretching for a half hour for the first time in 6 months, you get like, you're going to be sore as fuck from that. Um, the one thing that I was gonna say at some point in the middle is when you brought up food, eating before bed. This was not originally a hot take I had written down, but I am a big believer in my own experience of eating a massive bolus of carbs immediately before bed, maybe
Yeah.
an hour before bed, like consistently, man. If I have like 4 cups of rice like an hour before bed. Like you'll hear most people will be like, don't eat. Not only will they say don't eat before bed, but they also say specifically don't eat a big bolus of carbs before bed. I find it totally the opposite. Like I wake up less, usually, and I'm inconsistent with this, which I should be more consistent with it now that I'm saying it. I usually wake up to pee once or twice, and when I eat a big bolus of carbs, I don't. I feel more rested when I wake. So that's Ben's additional hot take, but that may be a disaster for someone else, as we're sort of alluding to. Um, I think we can probably finish up with maybe just one more, and I'll make it very brief. And since I think you have more and I also have more, we could probably just, I mean, we can fucking do this every week, but the last one I'll finish up with is, because if you really think about it, Ethan, our conversations, like
Yeah,
especially during the week,
yeah,
this is just like what it is, right?
always.
So, um, yeah. So the one thing that I will say, and this is, I'll start with the strongly worded version and then I'll scale it back a little bit, is I think that, and this is still very popular in the Instagram world, just for your knowledge, is just this concept of like mobility training and like being a mobility coach. Like there are people who self-advertise as I am a mobility coach or therapist, whatever that means. Um, I think that mobility training is like diet training. So for example, I think that the reason that a lot of people end up enjoying mobility training and seeing perceived or perceiving results from mobility training is because their normal training is so atrocious that the next best thing is basically just to put themselves in like deep stretches where they can accumulate some degree of like length and tension, and where potentially they can see a positive orthopedic or strength outcome as a consequence of the mobility thing. And my sort of belief about this is that if you understand resistance training, there pretty much, aside from enjoyment, becomes really no place for mobility related drills, and especially nothing that you would categorize as a dedicated mobility training routine. I think that there are cases on the fringe, especially in a rehab context, where that becomes much more relevant and consequential. But I think for most people, most of the time, even if they're not training through what we can call full joint ranges of motion, not necessarily full muscle, but full joint ranges of motion, based on what they have available to them, I think that the mobility training concept kind of becomes a moot concept for most people. And I won't. We could There are many branches of that, but if you have any general thoughts on that, interested to hear.
It makes me think about the failure lecture that I'm putting together for the members website,
Yeah.
and just this idea of failure living on a continuum, uh, such that if you're thinking outside of the typical implements we use in the gym, barbells, dumbbells, cable machine, that you can create machines where you create very different failure points because the machine is simply meeting your output at any one time. So basically, think of it as like a drop set. As you're able to produce less force in a given range, let's say just comparing the concentric to the eccentric, on any given rep, you're going to be able to win against the machine. Like you're going to be able to move the implement uh, with a certain degree of force, and then you're going to be able to lose to that implement essentially, like at a given speed that it's pushing against you, and you're losing that battle. Um, it's going to require less force essentially to lose that battle. Um, there is at any given point in time a maximal amount of force that you can apply physiologically, physics wise, like into that implement. And when we talk about things like resistance profiles, for example, the idea is as to match as closely as we can our output, or what we sometimes call like our strength profile for a given exercise, with the resistance profile of the machine. But when we're dealing uh, with systems that are relatively fixed in the sense that, yeah, we could build a cam, but that's going to be limited to how you've designed that and how you've built that machine up front versus the machine being able to adapt. So an example would be when you're helping me with the seated leg curls, you are responding to how much force I'm putting into the pad, and you're giving me assistance where I need it based on where I am in the range of motion, based on where I am in the set in terms of level of fatigue. Um, and you're just sensing that based on you being able to sense the tension through the pad, through the speed that the pad is moving, through your perception of my fatigue visually, audibly, all that sort of stuff. Like you're using a very human, you're using a degree of logic and intuition to determine how much to help me at any given point. And you could also build a machine that could do this, like an example where the intent is always to apply maximal force would be like in an isokinetic machine where it's moving at a constant speed, and at any point you're just basically pushing as hard as you can. So it's almost like this moving isometric in a
Hmm.
weird, which is obviously like uh,
Yeah.
contradictory. But if we just think outside the box, and we realize that like failure is only a construct basically of the constraints of the machine that we're using and the goal that we've established ahead of time. So we say like the goal is to move through this range of motion, and when I can't move through that range of motion anymore, I'm going to cut the exercise. And the constraint of the machine might be there's this much load, or really more so, there's this much torque, like at any point in the given range of motion. And when we're able to no longer meet that goal, or we're no longer able to meet the demand of the machine, we call that failure. And a lot of things, as I mentioned, not just resistance profile, but how you set up for that machine, whether it be like a pad on your thigh, a bench behind you, these things, that we're calling anchors, greatly change the amount of force that you're able to apply and when that appearance of failure will show up. And just tying this back to the concept of like stretching and resistance training, just simply that it lives along a continuum, and that humans in the sense become this imaginary device, in the sense that like the imaginary device can choose to apply a given degree of tension um, that meets the output of the person, of the exerciser, the stretchy, at any given point in time. But this could range anywhere from literally assisting you to giving you like a maximal eccentric resistance where we just say, okay, there's some given speed, right? Like once this implement is moving down at the speed of gravity, once this thing is accelerating at 9.8 meters per second, we're going to say like you're no longer controlling it, right?
Yeah.
Anywhere along that continuum of you're able to move this thing at any given speed concentrically to you're not able to control it at any given speed eccentrically, to now maybe we're even helping you as a stretch would be like get into the position and then holding you there, whether you're actively pressing it into the person or not. There's just this continuum of like what we're calling stretch to what we're calling resistance, and it could be applied by a person, it could be applied by an implement or a machine, but I think it's all fundamentally just dealing with force, and where someone is along that continuum is determines how much force and in what positions you want to challenge them in. So, a maximum intensity or 100% 1 RM for certain people is getting out of a chair. And that's what they're able to deal with at that moment. So for a person who's bedridden, like, or a person who needs to access a specific range that they don't currently have access to because of maybe like a sporting constraint, you know, maybe the amount of force that they can deal with at that given time or the appropriate tool to get them there is another person. And the person resisting them or the person taking them there, like that could be the right tool at the right time for the right person. But I think it still just lives along a continuum, much like failure does. And if we think outside the idea, the concepts of like traditional, how we traditionally frame resistance training, and just look at it as concepts of force and concepts of muscular position, it's all the same thing. So
Hmm.
there will ultimately be some people under some conditions where what appears to be a stretch, just like we call things compounds and we call things isolation, when you're talking to someone, you would probably still tell them like, I'm stretching you, but it's more just pedantic and it's more to just help them um, build it into a simple framework than it is something that's fundamentally different from having them do an exercise.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really good. I hope people followed that
And
along.
I don't think they probably did, but
No,
this
because
is where it's
because
coming
because
from.
I followed it and it was really good, and I want to just make it very concrete for people to kind of be like,
Please do.
because when people will hear this back or if they listen back, they'll have a very good understanding of it. Um, in essence, and you can correct me if this is misinterpreted at all, the overall perspective and takeaway is essentially that regardless of whether we're resistance training, doing some kind of Zumba class, doing some kind of yoga class, self-stretching, assisted stretching, what we're ultimately dealing with is a system of anatomical structures, i.e., anatomy, and its interaction with the external world. And the interaction between anatomy and force is present in all of these things. And what specifically creates distinctions between, let's say, yoga and resistance training is really, at least on some level, what we call those things. And really, what you're pointing to is the fact that both yoga and resistance training are people and people's interaction with force. And ultimately, the particularities of what that looks like may change. But what you're pointing to with this discussion of a spectrum is you're saying we have anatomy plus force, and that is exercise, and that is yoga, and that is Zumba. And specifically, what the specific interactions are, the magnitudes of those interactions, the time frame of those interactions, that's what determines what sort of compartment we put each of these things into, but that ultimately they're all sort of things that sit under the same umbrella.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And a lot of what then contextualizes it might just be the environment.
Yeah.
If you're doing a split squat in yoga, it really may just come down to, do you like the type of people who associate with yoga? Do you like the idea that this is for, a goal of lengthening and toning versus, strengthening? But the reality is like, um, if someone was doing an isometric split squat for 15 seconds in the gym, and they could have spent those 15 seconds with, two 30-pound dumbbells moving through, concentric and eccentric, if the explicit goal was to, tone or gain muscle, then it probably wouldn't be a good choice. It would be a very ineffective strategy
Hmm.
for that. But it still fundamentally follows the same laws, like you said.
Yeah. And yet I believe in yoga, we call a split squat warrior pose or something.
Yeah, well, there's some like rotation in the trunk there too.
Yeah, I remember my brother once asking me, my oldest brother, he was asking me if I had ever heard of warrior pose. And I was like, no, I don't think so. And then he did it. And I was like, oh, like a lunge? And he was like, yeah, it's a lunge, I guess. But okay, that's a great stopping point. And I thought this was great. I think in some ways, our hot takes are less hot than are less hot in some sense because most of it is like just explanation and exploration. It's not like we're saying mobility is garbage and then we're moving on. So it's maybe it's not necessarily hot. It's more like spicy, you know. It's kind of a combination of temperature and texture, but yeah. If everyone has made it this far, Thanks for listening. And if you are not yet a member of the online community, a link will be in the description wherever you're listening to join that and start your first week free trial.